Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Miss Haywood Helps. This week we're going to be going over the Civil Rights Movement. The standard for this unit is SS5H6, which is describe the importance of key people, events, and developments between 1950 and 1975. We will touch on each sub-factor of this standard. A, analyze the effects of Jim Crow laws and practices. B, explain the key events and people of the Civil Rights Movement, Brown versus Board of Education, Montgomery bus boycott, the March on Washington, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and civil rights activities of Thurgood Marshall, Lyndon B. Johnson, Cesar, Chavez, Rosa Parks, and Martin Luther King Jr. C, describe the impact on American society of the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr., and discuss the significance of the technologies of television and space exploration. There are two essential questions for this unit. The first is, can you elaborate on the following key events of the Civil Rights Movement? Brown versus Board of Education, Montgomery bus boycott, the March on Washington, the Civil Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act. The second question is, can you explain the role and activities of the following key people during the Civil Rights Movement? Thurgood Marshall, Lyndon B. Johnson, Cesar Chavez, Rosa Parks, and Martin Luther King Jr. We will discuss each of these key events and each of these key people. Feel free to pause the video and take notes. I suggest that you get comfortable, get out a notebook, and get ready to learn. Before the start of the Civil Rights Movement, we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that were ratified into the Constitution. These were also known as the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. This meant that slavery was no longer legal in the United States. The 14th Amendment made African Americans citizens. This guaranteed us equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment guaranteed African Americans the right to vote. These amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, were supposed to protect the rights of newly freed slaves, African Americans, under the U.S. Constitution, but they were unable to protect the rights of African Americans because of some Supreme Court rulings, which we are going to discuss. The first of these rulings was Plessy versus Ferguson. This was a landmark decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in May of 1896 that upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation in public facilities, as long as these segregated facilities were equal in quality. This became known as separate but equal. Homer Plessy was a man living in New Orleans. He was 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 Black. Back then, that meant that he was considered African American. While working with the Committee of Citizens, he decided to sit in the whites-only car on a train. When he was ordered to move because he was considered an African American, he refused and he was arrested. When his lawyer argued his case, he argued that separate but equal was against the 13th and 14th Amendments. The judge hearing the case, Ferguson, ruled that separate but equal was in fact constitutional, and when his case was brought before the Supreme Court, they upheld his ruling. This is where we see the introduction of the Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws were state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the southern United States. They all were enacted between the late 19th and early 20th centuries by white, Democratic-dominated state legislators after the Reconstruction period. These laws were enforced until 1965. Jim Crow laws were named after a Black minstrel show character. These laws included literacy tests, poll taxes, and the grandfather clause. Literacy tests were tests that deemed whether the person taking the test could read or write, which was unfair to African Americans because they were newly free-slaved and it was illegal to educate slaves. This meant that they were illiterate. Poll taxes were unfair because these newly free slaves were living, most of them were living on the plantations that they had worked on when they were slaves as sharecroppers. They were not making very much money and therefore could not afford the poll taxes. The grandfather clause was a clause that said anyone who had voted before 1867 could vote without literacy tests, poll taxes, or having to own property. And this also included their descendants, thus the grandfather clause. The 15th Amendment was not ratified until 1870, so this excluded all African Americans. Lynchings were also very prevalent during this time. This was when African Americans were taken to a public place and hung while white spectators looked on. We can trace the beginnings of the Jim Crow laws to black codes. This dictated when, where, and how blacks could work and where they could live and how much they could make. It also legalized the seizure of their children for labor purposes. Jim Crow laws expanded in the 1880s all over the country. They included segregation of public parks, theaters, waiting rooms for buses and trains, water fountains, restrooms, even cashier counters, hospitals, jails, and neighborhoods. The Jim Crow laws essentially were meant to keep African Americans from flourishing within the country. Now we have come to the Supreme Court ruling of Brown versus Board of Education. Oliver Brown filed a class action lawsuit against the Board of Ed in Topeka, Kansas, when his daughter, Linda Brown, was denied access to Topeka's all-white schools. His case and 4 other cases that were in the courts at that time were all combined and argued before the Supreme Court by then lawyer Thurgood Marshall. He eventually became the first African American named to the Supreme Court. This ruling is extremely important because it overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, stating that separate was in fact not equal. This ruling gave improved educational opportunities to African Americans, but it took America a long time to get on board, and schools were not fully desegregated for a long time after this. We can trace the beginnings of the civil rights movement back to the Montgomery bus boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott was a civil rights protest during which African Americans refused to ride city buses in Montgomery, Alabama, to protest segregated seating. The boycott took place from December 5, 1955 to December 20, 1956, and is regarded as the first large-scale U.S. demonstration against segregation. A little bit of background on the Montgomery bus boycott. On December 1, 1955, a local seamstress and NAACP secretary named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white passenger and was subsequently arrested. She was bailed out of jail by a civil rights leader, and local civil rights leader decided to capitalize on her arrest as a chance to challenge local segregation laws. They called for a one-day boycott of the buses on December 5th. 90% of African Americans stayed off the buses that day, which was important because 75% of the people who utilized the Montgomery buses were African Americans. This prompted leaders to extend the bus boycott indefinitely. A group of local ministers called the Montgomery Improvement Association, or MIA for short, came together to support and sustain the boycott. Martin Luther King Jr. ended up being elected the president. MIA asked for the leaders of the bus companies and the local officials to meet, and they asked for them to have first come, first served seating on the buses and to hire African American drivers for the routes that were primarily African American. The bus companies and local officials refused, and whites retaliated by bombing Martin Luther King Jr.'s house. Police arrested protesters, and most of them were fired from their jobs if they were found supporting the Montgomery bus boycott. MIA ended up filing a suit against bus segregation on June 5, 1956. A federal district court declared that segregation on buses was unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court upheld this ruling. Due to his efforts during the Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King Jr. was selected by local civil rights leaders to be the face of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister and social rights activist in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. He was a leader of the American Civil Rights Movement. He organized a number of peaceful protests as the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, including the famous March on Washington, which we will discuss later. Martin Luther King was an advocate for nonviolent protesting, including civil rights marches, which were the most common form of protest during the civil rights movement, freedom riders, which were whites and blacks riding together on buses in the South to protest the South's segregation of bus terminals, and sit-ins, where African Americans sat at counters of white restaurants and did not leave until they were served or arrested. While there are many leaders of the civil rights movement, some of the key leaders include Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, John Lewis, Medgar Evans, and Stokely Carmichael. Some of the key organizations during the civil rights movement were the NAACP, which was the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Council, and CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. The movement began to gain national attention as violence against leaders and participants increased. Some key examples were the blasting of protesters with fire hoses and the attacking of protesters by police dogs, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 young girls who were attending Sunday school, the murder of Emmett Till, the Little Rock Nine, and all that was done to them as they were trying to attend a newly desegregated school, the disappearance of 3 civil rights workers in the summer of 1964. Weeks later, they were found dead after having been killed by the members of the KKK, and the numerous lynchings that took place during this time. John F. Kennedy's administration responded to civil rights protests that turned violent by sending federal marshals to escort African American students to newly integrated schools and to protect protesters and civil rights leaders. John F. Kennedy gave many speeches against the violence that was taking place and came on national airways to tell American people that he planned to ask Congress to act and move forward with desegregating public places and schools. He sent a civil rights bill to Congress on June 19, 1963. Despite his push for civil rights legislation, he was assassinated before Congress was able to pass a bill. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated while riding in a Dallas motorcade. Before JFK's assassination, Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders joined with him to organize the March on Washington. This march was to support President Kennedy's civil rights bill. The March on Washington was held in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday, August 28, 1963. The purpose of the march was to advocate for the civil and economic rights of African Americans. An estimated number of 250,000 people attended the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedoms on August 28, 1963. They arrived in Washington, D.C. by planes, trains, cars, and buses from all over the country. Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech during the March on Washington. After JFK's assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This outlawed segregation in public places, at schools, at public parks. Anywhere that American citizens could congregate could no longer be segregated. And it also gave them equal access to facilities such as restaurants and theaters. It is important to know that during the civil rights movement, another group of people were fighting for their rights as well, the Latino community. Many of them were migrant workers and were being denied basic human rights in America. A labor and civil rights leader named Cesar Chavez led them on a journey to equality. He garnered national attention in 1965 when he joined forces with the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee to strike against California grape growers. In 1966, the unions merged to form the United Farm Workers. For years, he battled the grape growers for better compensation and improved work conditions. He was a prominent union leader and labor organizer. Hardened by his early experience as a migrant worker, Chavez founded the National Farm Workers Association in 1962. The two organizations later merged to become the United Farm Workers. This was the Agricultural Workers Organization Committee and his committee, the National Farm Workers Association. Stressing nonviolent methods, much like Martin Luther King Jr., he drew attention to his causes via boycotts, marches, and hunger strikes. Despite conflicts with the Teamsters Union and legal barriers, he was able to secure raises and improve conditions for farm workers in California, Texas, Arizona, and Florida. Before the Civil Rights Act was signed, the 24th Amendment was ratified into the Constitution on January 23, 1964. This prohibited any poll taxes in elections of federal officials. The southern states were not abiding by this, however, and they were still upholding the Jim Crow laws. During a protest against these Jim Crow laws in February 1965, state troopers clubbed protesters and fatally shot 26-year-old Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was an African-American demonstrator just trying to protect his mother, who was being beaten by police. In response to this violence, civil rights leaders planned to take their cause directly to Alabama Governor George Wallace on a 54-mile march from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery. When they were marching, protesters were met by troopers who beat them and tear gassed them, and this day became known as Bloody Sunday, and it was shown nationally across the country. Lyndon B. Johnson was infuriated by what was happening and decided then to sign into law the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This allowed federal voting examiners to step in where local examiners prevented African Americans from voting. It is important to note the significance of television during this time. During the 1960s, television revolutionized the American way of life. This was important because the entire country could be made aware of what was happening during the Civil Rights Movement, what the presidents and the government were doing about it, and they were made aware of ways they could become involved. Television also shed light on national and international issues. In 1950, only 10% of Americans owned a TV. By 1960, 90% of homes owned a TV. TV changed the way Americans saw themselves and the world because it brought the world right into their homes. Space exploration was also important during this time. Being able to go and explore space was also a great technological development. Before his assassination, President Kennedy announced a goal to put a man on the moon by 1970, starting the race to space between the Americans and the Soviet Union. That goal was accomplished by Neil Armstrong in 1969. The direct benefits of space exploration include an increase in the knowledge that is out there about space and the discovery of distant planets and galaxies, and it also gives us insight into the beginnings of our universe. The end of the Civil Rights Movement can be marked by the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated by James Earl Ray on April 4, 1968, on the second-floor balcony near his room at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, where he had been supporting Black sanitation workers on strike for better pay and working conditions. His assassination devastated the African American community and the United States as a whole. Another important assassination to know about during this time was the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. Robert F. Kennedy, who was John F. Kennedy's brother, was an advocate for issues related to human rights and social justice, and he formed relationships with Martin Luther King Jr. and Cesar Chavez. In 1968, Kennedy became a leading candidate for the Democratic nomination for presidency by appealing to poor African Americans, Hispanic, Catholics, and young voters. He was assassinated on June 5, 1968. This concludes the Civil Rights Unit. Remember, you should be able to answer the listed essential questions based on the information that was given and based on the notes that you took. If you would like more information on key events and on key people during the Civil Rights Movement, I encourage you to visit civilrightstrail.com, Britannica.com, history.com, and of course YouTube.com, which has a plethora of videos specifically on each key event and each key person during the Civil Rights Movement. This concludes this episode of Miss Haywood Helps. See you next time.